Hello everybody, this is General Yanis, and today in Death Card Tactics I will be looking at the best stratagems for the Plague Marines and how are we getting the most bang for our command points. So let's get started. So today the 7th of April 21, closing up to the games for 650 points on the Crusade, but I've also been a little bit starting to read up on the Drukhari new rules. And it's really interesting with an army that's basically the opposite of Death Card. So you have these very fast enemies, but only toughness 3. And I have difficulty to take an opponent with toughness 3. I'd be very afraid of those, but I know they can do quite a lot, and they are fast and can bypass our toughness, etc. But I will be looking forward to making some sort of review of the Drukhari. But as I said in this video, I will be looking at the most efficient stratagems to buff the Plague Marines in the new codex and how we can get the most bang for our command points. So in my previous video, I was looking at all the stratagems, and then I was starting to think how can we rate them and how can it be, and then I was thinking to look, for example, for Plague Marines, how many extra wounds can be done by using various stratagems in different type of scenarios, and where do we actually get the most wounds for the command points we spend. The command points, of course, being a limited resource, and when is it best to use them. So with no further ado, let's take a look. So the stratagems that are applicable to Plague Marines and that are considered in this analysis I've illustrated here. So we have the pre-battle. Before the game, we can use a Champion of Disease for 1 command point to give a Plague Marine champion a relic out of 4 relics. And here it's interesting to look at the Plague Skull of Glothilla relic or the Plague Bringer relic. They can't get the Reaper of Glorious Entropy, and the operating plate is basically no point in getting that to your Plague Marine champion. But one of those two could be quite an interesting choice for a Plague Marine champion. And then if we look at the shooting phase, we have the virulent rounds. For 1 command points, the bolter become plague weapons, so they can reroll the wound roll of 1. And then we have the Blightening. For 1 command point, we can select 3 models in the army to use the grenades as pistols, which can be really good in engagement range. And then we have the Plague Brewers for 1 command point. If we have the Mortarion Sun Plague Company, this makes the Plague Spewers and Plague Belchers that Marines can have become damage 2 weapons instead of damage 1 weapon for that shooting. In the shooting or fight phase, we can select the Eternal Hatred for 2 command points, giving the whole unit +1 to wound, previously Veterans of the Long War. And then we have the Sickly Corrosion for 2 command points, and this is affecting the enemy unit, so all weapons targeting the corroded enemy can reroll once to wound. So that's interesting, for example, to make things that are not bolters like plasma guns or meltas or something like this, being able to roll once to wound. In the fight phase, we have the Trench Fighters for 1 command point, giving our Plague Marines an extra attack with a Plague Knife per model. We have the Creeping Blight for 1 command point, where 6s to wound with a Plague weapon become AP -4. So this would, for example, transform the knives from AP -1 to AP -4, but only on 6s to wound. And then we have the Haze of Corruption, which says that all damage that this unit does must be allocated on the enemy. So this could be quite interesting if we have high damage, multi-damage weapons, and we're fighting enemies with, for example, only 1 wound or 2 wounds. As a reference benchmark of what can be achieved with command points, I will look at the Mutant Strain, a 1 CP stratagem for the Poxwalkers, also coupled with the Wrathful Dead for 1 CP stratagem for the Harbingers. So let's start with the Poxwalkers reference case. So if we use the Mutant Strain stratagem in the fight phase, 6s to hit will give mortal wounds to the enemy, and 1s to hit will give mortal wounds to the Poxwalkers. But basically the Poxwalkers, they have a 6+ feel no pain, so maybe they could save a few, and you would be losing, let's say, a 5-point model, whereas the 6s to hit, giving mortal wounds to a very valuable enemy unit is more worth it than losing a few Poxwalkers, let's say. The maximum effect you could get with a Mutant Strain is, of course, with a unit of 20 Poxwalkers. The maximum, of course, if you only have 10 Poxwalkers, you would be doing half the amount of damage on average. 20 Poxwalkers will be having 40 attacks, and a sixth of those should be 6s to hit on average, giving 6.5 mortal wounds regardless of the target. So this is a really good output. So for one command point, we can deal 6.5 mortal wounds if we have the 20 Poxwalkers in melee with the target. But if we have a Harbingers and we can add the Wrathful Dead for one command point, and together with the Mutant Strain, this allows us for full rerolls. Then the 6.5 mortal wounds would be 10 mortal wounds on average if we only choose to reroll the misses. So 1, 2, 3 dice rolls. The four pluses are hits with the Poxwalkers with a weapon skill of 4+ now. But if we select to go for a maximum mortal wounds and totally disregard that, we don't want so many ones. If we reroll anything that is not a 6, we should be on average being able to do 12.2 mortal wounds. So this is a crazy amount of damage, but it cost us 2 command points, so we will still be doing 5 to 6 mortal wounds per CP if we are looking at where our command points are doing the most damage. So here you can see the 20 Poxwalkers, the average damage they would do without any stratagem, the average damage they would do with the Mutant Strain across the variety of targets I'm usually simulating, and then the extra damage per command point, as we see here, is let's say 5 to 6 with both stratagems, or 6.5 on average with the Mutant Strain. So let's use that as a benchmark to see what we can do with Plague Marines. So let's start by looking at the Plague Marine champion upgrades. So let's say that we are using the champion stratagem to give the champion a Plague Skull of Glothilla relic for one command point before the battle. Then it allows him once per battle at the end of movement. We can select an enemy within 6 inches, then we roll 7 dice. 4s and 5s give 1 mortal wound, and 6s give D3 mortal wounds. This would on average give 4.66 mortal wounds for one command point, so this is quite good value. Not as good as the Mutant Strain, but a lot better than many other choices. So the Plague Skull of Glothilla that I also a bit missed when I was looking at the relic is gives a good bang for one command point. And also, as people point out, if you're facing something like a Nightbringer with limited number of woods it can take per phase, then this happens in the movement phase, giving some more opportunity to take a Nightbringer down. But again, a good value for the Plague Skull of Glothilla relic. We could also be using a command point to give a champion the Plaguebringer relic, which is replacing a Plague Knife for the Demonic Plague of the champion. And then the weapon will be Strength +2, AP -3, Damage 2 weapon. And it's a plague weapon, and destroyed models count as 2 in the amount of morale. And compared to a standard knife, the relic gives almost 1 wound extra per round of melee. And if you have this relic and your Plague Marines are in engagement and melee combat a couple of turns, let's say 3-4 turns, you would be getting 3-4 wounds extra out of this command point. So not as good, let's say, at the Plague of the Skull of Glothilla. And you could benefit more if you're taking a Chaos Lord. Probably it's better to give him the Plaguebringer relic to the Chaos Lord, but still could be potentially good value. Here you can see the average damage, not point corrected. Here we have the various targets. The blue line is the Plague Knife, the Demonic Blade is the orange, the yellow is the Power Fist, and then the gray is the Plaguebringer relic. If we look at the average damage across all targets, the Plague Knife, the champion would be doing 0.8 wounds across the variety of the targets. With the Plaguebringer relic, he will be doing 1.18 wounds across the various targets. Here the average, so we're benefiting 1 wound to the standard for the cost of 1 command point. You can see the Power Fist also does a better job than the Plague Knife for 10 points, then you don't spend the command point. But yeah, the Plaguebringer relic could also be interesting. Now, if we move on to the shooting phase, the Plague Marines, let's take an example when we are shooting at 24 inch, and we take in this example a squad of 10 Bolter Marines. And here, that would be, let's say, something where we could apply the virulent rounds for 1 command points, and then the bolters would become plague weapons. And this, of course, would be the highest effect you can get for that is a unit with 10 bolters. If you have special weapons or smaller units, then you would get less effect, of course. So the squad of the 10 bolters would make the maximum effect of the virulent rounds. Here, there is no point, if you have this squad of 10 bolter marines, there is no point into doing the cyclic corrosion if you only have this unit fighting against the enemy, because I mean, it's cheaper to do the virulent rounds to become plague weapons. We can also consider the Eternal Hatred, giving +1 to wound for the bolters. This can be helpful because their strength is only 4, so we could be wounding better, and in this range, we're probably not having the enemy within contagion range. For comparison, we are also looking at if we just give one of the guys in the squad a Blight Launcher for 20 points, and another comparison is let's take a Sigil of Decay for 10 points instead of, for example, using a stratagem. And here it's a bit difficult to see in this graph, but here we have the blue line is the 10 Plague Marines with the standard bolters, and then the best damage output is the orange line here, not point corrected or corrected in any way. This is the damage with the Internal Hatred, and the virulent rounds is the gray, so it's not as good, for example, as the light blue here, which is the Blight Launcher. And here, down here, I have the summary of the average damage they do across the targets. So we see the standard Plague Marines with bolters will be doing on average across the 31 targets here 2.5 wounds. If we do the Internal Hatred, we will be doing 4.3 wounds. Just adding a Blight Launcher guy, we got to 3.2 wounds, and the Sigil of Decay is doing 2.9 wounds. The Virulent Rounds also is doing 2.9 wounds, so you are, for the extra command point you are paying, you're on average only getting a gain of half a wound extra using one for this command point. The Eternal Hatred pays a bit better. You are doing almost 1 wound extra per command point, but not as good as some of the other stratagems we have seen. So if you want to get maybe some better shooting effect, probably it's better to go with the special weapons here, and the Blight Launcher would be able to give you this extra damage round after round, and you wouldn't need to add some command points to get a little bit of extra damage. In another shooting example for Plague Marines, here we have selected a shooty squad of Plague Marines with a maximum, let's say, 2 Blight Launchers and 3 plasmas. So 2 plasmas in the squad, and then the champion also has a plasma gun. Here we can look at the cyclic corrosion for 2 command points, since the plasmas and the bolters would be able to benefit from rerolls. Eternal Hatred again, +1 to wound, and here I'm assuming supercharging the plasmas, and the plasmas are in rapid fire range here. And here we see the average damage across all the targets for the baseline, where we are not using any stratagems, should be 6.5 wounds. And if we add the cyclic corrosion, then we are doing 7.3 wounds. So for 2 command points, we are only getting a little benefit, so it's only 0.4 wounds extra per command point. If we use the Eternal Hatred, we get a little bit better. We get 0.7, but still not as good, for example, as the Mutant Strain or some of the other things here. And so I think with a cyclic corrosion, multiple units should be benefiting for that to give a good effect. So if you have several units shooting at the enemy, then of course cyclic corrosion can pay off. But just to get, let's say, 1 unit of Plague Marine shooting at that, you're getting a little bit better, but it's not a crazy amount for these 2 command points you're paying. Eternal Hatred is also better, but still not as good as some of the other uses that we saw for the command points. So I think this squad, it probably is doing quite a lot of damage anyway, so maybe no point in using these 2 command points to improve its its shooting abilities. And then if we come to the Blightening, in this example, in the shooting, we're watching this very good stratagem for the grenades. If the Plague Marines are in engagement range in the shooting phase, then the Blightening, choosing 3 Plague Marines in engagement range that they can auto hit with 6 grenades, will basically be a bonus damage, because the Plague Marines cannot shoot when they are in engagement range. Only the champion can shoot his bolt pistol or plasma pistol, but normally you wouldn't be able to do any damage in the shooting phase. So if you are in engagement range, then definitely consider the Blightening. We can also investigate the case that the Plague Marines are at 6-inch range. And here we can also use it for, if we are at very close range, we can use the Blightening so that our melee Plague Marines can shoot 3 of the melee Marines that otherwise wouldn't shoot, can use the Blightening, but then they don't auto hit. And also comparing a scenario, let's say that we have 3 guys with a bolter. Would it pay off to use 3 instead of shooting with the bolters? They can shoot with the Blightening. And here we can see the average damage expected across 31 targets I'm typically simulating. So if we take 3 models of Plague Marine with the Blightening in engagement range, we should be doing 5.2 wounds on average. And this is only for a cost of 1 command point. So basically we paid 1 command point and we got 5.2 wounds extra here that we wouldn't be otherwise doing any damage. If we are looking at a scenario where we have 3 melee Plague Marines within 6-inch range and we use the Blightening, we are only getting 2.65 wounds. Here I didn't assume we have the -1 toughness, and here of course we don't have the auto hit that we have in the engagement range, but still we're getting 2.6 wounds for 1 command point. And then here we see that what is the difference. If they had bolters, we would still be doing the same damage, but the guys with the bolter, if we didn't choose the stratagem, they would be doing some damage by themselves, so we will be getting 1.9 wounds for 1 command points. So Blightening in engagement range gives definitely a good bang for the command point spent, also useful in range, but less efficient in dealing the damage. And if your models have shooting weapons, it's better to wait until in engagement range, but it could still be helpful if you are facing some horde enemies, because you would be, even at range, you would having 18 shots instead of 6 bolter shots, maybe clearing out a big horde unit before you charge. And finally, for the shooting, in this example, I'm looking at the Plague Brewers from Rotarian Sun, so that makes the Plague Spewers and Plague Belchers damage 2 instead of damage 1. And in this example, I'm looking at the best ideal scenario for this. So we have a big unit of Plague Marines where we have the maximum number of 2 Plague Spewers and 2 Plague Belchers. That's the maximum of these weapons we can have in this squad. And here I'm looking at the scenario with the blue. We don't use the stratagem, and if we have access to the stratagem for 1 command point, we do the orange damage here. So it improves quite a lot, but not really if we are shooting on 1 wound models, like for example the Fire Warriors here or Guardsmen or something like this, then it doesn't make sense, of course. But if we're shooting especially 2 wound models like the Intercessors here, it really helps us to make significantly more wounds. On average, across all the targets, we will be going up from 5.5 damage on average to 7.5 damage on average. So almost, let's say, 2 extra damage for 1 command point. So if you have these weapons, if you have Mortarian Suns, probably you will be trying to pull off and make this stratagem useful, and especially if you're targeting 2 wound targets. So let's move over to the fight phase and melee. So here we have the -1 toughness contagion in effect. We have the Plague Marines, and here I'm looking at the effect of trench fighters. For 1 command point, we get 1 additional knife attack per model. Max, and of course the maximum effect we will be getting with this stratagem is when we have a maxed unit of Plague Marines, 10 Plague Marines. But basically, regardless of weapons, because all the Plague Marines basically have the access to the knife. Even if they get a flail, they would be able to do at least one extra attack with a Plague Knife. Then the Creeping Blight, as I said, on a 60 wound, the Plague weapons became AP -4, and then we can also use the Eternal Hatred for +1 to wound. So here in the graph we see the yellow one, the blue and yellow down here is basically the standard Plague Marines, and then the orange one is the Trench Fighters. So the Trench Fighters giving 10 extra attacks instead of almost 21 attacks with knives in this example, gives us, of course, a better damage output. So we can see here the average damage across all the targets with no stratagems and only Plague Marines with standard bolters and knives is 5.3. If we add the Trench Fighters, we go up to 7.9 wounds. So for one command point, we will be doing 2.5 wounds extra. The Eternal Hatred gives us a bit extra damage, but not as good as the Trench Fighters, and it doesn't give us so much extra damage per command point, even worse than on the Bolter, because I think here the Plague Knives are benefiting from the -1 toughness. The Creeping Blight in itself is lackluster damage, and even if we combine the Trench Fighters and the Creeping Blight, of course we get better wounds, but we spent 2 command points to do so, so we are only getting 1.5 extra wounds per each command point. So the Trench Fighter gives the best effect for the command point spent in melee. Finally, in melee, let's look at the Haze of Corruption for 2 command points, which is doing that we can, the unit, all the wounds that the Plague Marines will be doing has to be allocated. And of course, to get a good effect of this stratagem, we can analyze the case where 10 Plague Marines have the maximum number of multi-wound weapons. So that would be 2 Plague Cleavers with a d6 damage, the 2 Flails that have damage 2, 2 Mace of Contagion that have damage 3, and the Power Fist with damage 2 on the champion. And let's say here I've selected a few examples. Of course, if we are attacking a multi-wound tank or something, then it doesn't make sense to use the Haze of Corruption because most of the damage will be allocated. If we are fighting something with damage 3 or 4 or something like that, then again, not much damage will be wasted. So here I'm looking at the cases where we are attacking a 1 wound target and a 2 wound target. So in the 1 wound, I've been looking at, for example, a unit of Gene Stealers, and in the 2 wound, I've been looking at a unit of Intercessors. So if we take this squad here versus the Gene Stealers, we see the different weaponry we have here, how many hit rolls they are getting, how many hits are scored, how many wounds are scored, how much is not saved. The Gene Stealers, they have a 5+ inval save, and then basically everything that's not saved is only doing 1 damage. So we are losing out a lot of damage here. But if we had the Haze of Corruption, we would be doing this amount of damage instead. So for example, for each flail, we would kill, let's say, 2 Gene Stealers instead of only 1, making 10 wounds in essence and not wasting the damage. The mace would be killing 3, and the cleavers would be killing 3.5 per hit, and the power fist 2. So in this case, we would be, from the expected damage, making 10 wounds with these weapons. We would be doing 25 wounds in this case. So we'll be getting 15 more wounds for 2 command points. So this is really a very good output in this very specific case. And then if we look at the Intercessors, then the effect is not as good because the flail and the power fist will not basically lose so much, will not lose damage. They are damage 2, and we are hitting wound 2 models, but the cleavers and the mace would be able to allocate a bit more damage. So in this case, we will be getting 5 more wounds for 2 command points. So of course, versus 1 wound targets, the Haze of Corruption can really make a lot of extra damage if you have the multi-damage weapons in your squad. As I said, in the Gene Stealers example, we would have 12.5 extra wounds per command point. However, many times, if there is a small unit, maybe you will be killing them off even without needing to spend this amount of command points to do so. In the example with the 2 wound intercessors, we will still get 2.5 wounds extra per the command point we are paying for the Haze of Corruption. So in this table now I'm reaching the summary of this video. So the Plague Marines, the buffing stratagems summary. So here we see the different stratagems, how much command points they cost, at which phase we can use them, and then the average extra damage we are getting per command point across the various targets. So starting with the Poxwalkers as a reference, the Mutant Strain, it gives us 6.5 mortal wounds if they are 20 Poxwalkers, of course. If they are less, they would be doing less, of course. And this is, of course, mortal wounds. And then we can see the different scenarios and the different benefits of the different stratagems, so we can see which ones are standing out. The Blightening is really important to remember, because especially if you have Plague Marines or units with grenades locked in engagement range, remember to use it. For 1 command point you can do a very good 5 wounds on average for the 3 models, so that's really good. The Plague Skull of Glothilla relic is also up there with 5 wounds per command point. You pay it once, you can use it once per battle. If you do the Plague Brewers for Mortarion Sun, that could be okay if you have the Spewers and the Belchers. The Trench Fighters, if you have a big group of Plague Marines, seems to be okay for 1 command point. It's better than the alternative, for example, the Creeping Blight. Of course, if you have multiple command points to spend, you can do that in very important fights, but the Trench Fighter seems to be giving you the most bang for your buck in melee. In the shooting, the stratagems, the virulent rounds, the eternal hatred, they don't give as much as some other combinations. Maybe here it's better to consider special weapons to increase the damage of your units rather before the battle, let's say, rather than spending a lot of command points on virulent rounds, for example. And then the Haze of Corruption, as I said, especially if you have the multi-damage weapons and you are fighting 1 wound targets, it can be interesting to consider. But otherwise, yeah, it's 2 command points, so it should be used only if you have this type of matchups. So some summary and final thoughts. The Plague Marines have access to a number of buffing stratagem. The math analysis so far looks good on giving the Plague Marine champion relics before the battle, especially the Plague Skull of Glothilla, making it an additional you can score a lot of nice mortal wounds for 1 command point in essence. The Blightening stands out and is really good, especially in engagement range, giving 5 wounds on average, and this is purely bonus damage as far as the Plague Marines are concerned. If they're still locked in combat with an enemy, I used it in my 2000 point battle to finish off the 4 veteran vanguards, and it was really nice to use this stratagem. In melee, the Trench Fighters can be useful with a large group of Marines, not as good as some of the others in output, but seems to be one of the best ones when we are in melee with a big unit of Plague Marines. The Haze of Corruption can be really strong versus the correct enemy if we are facing 1 wound or 2 wound opponents, and we have a lot of multi-damage weapons. In shooting, it seems like it's better to consider special weapons on the Marines, or of course they can be buffed by the Tollkeeper relic or auras from the other units. But because the stratagems like Eternal Hatred or the Virulent rounds don't do much extra damage for normal bolters, considering the command point they're costing. So this summarizes the video. What do you think about the stratagems, and has your experience on the battlefield, does it match the the calculated values here? What are your thoughts? Please leave some comments please leave some comments below. If you like this video, please press like and subscribe to the channel, where I will be bringing you more data and analysis on Death Guard, and also some more armies going forward. If you want to help my efforts in maintaining the high activity for this channel, please visit my Patreon page, patreon.com General Yanis. And with these words, General Yanis is signing out. Stay safe out there, and bye-bye.